Hi everyone, and welcome to April's Nomensa webinar. Today's session is hosted by our creative director, Chris Richards, titled How to Stay on Top of Your Creative Game When Working Remotely. In this webinar, Chris is going to share some tips and tricks on how to stay creative, tune out distractions, connect and collaborate with remote teams, and find inspiration in a post-pandemic world. Chris will draw on some examples from his role here at Nomensa and some of the many personal projects he's been working on too. Please get involved and say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure you switch your chat settings to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages, and do let us know if there's any issues with the stream. Also, please ask lots of questions using the Q&A function. I'll be asking these to Chris at the end, and I'll try to get through as many as I can. We will be sharing the recording as soon as we can after the session today. And also we're using Rev for auto-generated closed captions. Whilst these are quite accurate, it does sometimes get a few words muddled up but when we make this session available, we'll make sure these are 100% accurate, so please do bear with us. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Chris to kick things off.
Hi, cheers. Thanks for that intro. Hi guys, I think we had quite an overwhelming response to this, so I'm really grateful that you had time in your day to come and visit us and watch this presentation. So, you know, as Henry kind of gave that introduction here, what we kind of really want to touch on is, you know, what the world for, especially within a creative context, is looking like now in a remote reality. So, you know, digital has always been able to work remotely. But there are certain things that the pandemic has kind of caused us to reflect on, how we can better improve our processes. But one of the key aspects of today's talk is to talk about how we can kind of try to simulate the environment that we would have traditionally experienced within remote context, working from home in your own space. So as Henry kind of mentioned there, we've got a few kind of tips and ways of being able to kind of conquer that and improve that process. So, you know, it's just a little bit of introduction about who I am. My name is Chris Richards. I'm the creative director at Nomensa. I've been working at Nomensa for about 7 years. And these aren't all of the inclusive clients that we kind of work on, but the purpose of putting this here is because I wanted to show you a spectrum of, you know, what we deal with day to day, really. And it is a very wide range of clients. You know, we're looking at kind of fintech, looking at, you know, more sort of the GDS style of very focused, pragmatic design versus more kind of conceptual, expressive design. And we have, you know, kind of a very sort of collaborative, exciting relationship with our clients and how we kind of make that work. So, I mean, typically what you would see, I guess, or what I'm kind of responsible for is very much a kind of end-to-end experience. So I love pitching, I love going out, talking publicly and being able to kind of create at the start of a project, very sort of conceptual ideas that then become, you know, through a process of various workshops, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with and do all the time as well, you know, getting all the client needs and requirements, but then also kind of working with the team closely to ensure that, you know, from the UX perspective, we've got everything kind of wrapped up, and then we make sure that we can add this level of creativity, and it should really be a lifeblood that goes across the whole process. So in my day-to-day, I kind of go across lots of digital outputs, you know, from mobile apps to illustration to various levels of animation. But then what I also like to do, what I think is really key and important, is to also kind of practice your process outside of work. And I've got a few kind of tips about how we can kind of help that, and how we can improve that and nurture that, and how that can eventually become a part of the output for your physical day-to-day. So there is quite a lot of my personal work in here. My personal work is a little bit more sort of science fiction driven than some of my commercial stuff. But due to kind of like, you know, client relationships, NDAs, I kind of have to draw the line between what I can and can't show from a commercial perspective. But you will see how we bridge the two together as we go through this presentation. So what's this talk about? As I mentioned before, you may have recently said, you know, now you're in perhaps a hybrid working environment, or we might be going into another lockdown. We don't know how the future will pan. But what we do know is hybrid working is now going to be a kind of more of an accessible day-to-day experience for a lot of us. So you may have said to yourself, you know, now I'm working at home in my own space, I should be able to push things a little bit further. I don't have the hustle and bustle of the studio. I don't have those random interruptions. So I should be able to really hone in and focus on how I can make things work better and how I can create things that are a little bit more sort of fresh and a little bit more new, because I'm focused, I'm in my own space. Or you may have felt, more in a kind of lockdown environment, that I can't go out on the weekends or the evenings. So, I don't really have an excuse but to be able to do these things, but to push things a little bit further. Or you may just feel a sense of creative pressure. You may feel like I'm so used to working in a collaborative studio, and now I'm on my own, and I know that I can still communicate to people through Zoom, but I'm not able to kind of have that organic conversation. And myself as creative director, I've been struggling with the idea of being able to kind of bounce ideas off my peers, or do the classic over the shoulder check in and stuff like that. So I kind of feel like when I look back on what I've achieved in the last year, especially when we've been focused heavy in the lockdown periods, there's this idea of being able to compare the quality of work from in the studio versus remotely. And I think in a way, actually, because we did a poll and some of the results were quite positive, that people, or yourselves within this more of a remote environment, have thrived in that area. So it's really good to see the balance between that idea of creative pressure in and outside of a physical environment. So what's in it for you? Interesting. So really glad you guys are all here. And I'm hoping that what I can do is I can offer practical tips for a relatively ambiguous subject. Creativity is traditionally mysterious, subjective, and partially ambiguous. I did a bunch of research for this talk, and I was looking into different types of creative directors or industry leaders, of how they can distill the term creativity into a presentation. And it's really difficult, because a lot of the time it either ends up with really famous pieces of work that you might have insight to a process, or it ends up with like quotes from Steve Jobs or Picasso of how creativity is somewhat, a part of your internal being as opposed to a process, etc. So it's really hard to kind of create something that is slightly more practical, and being able to kind of distill that into a presentation, so you guys can leave here with perhaps some inspiration, some tips, or it might just be cathartic. This might be something that you guys actually do day to day, and it might be liberating to hear those processes said back to you. So ABC, quite creatively there, I've attempted to create the chapters of this presentation into 3 key areas. So we're first going to talk about our new ambient environment. Like, what does that mean? Where are we? How's the best way to utilize our space? It's more exciting than it sounds. And then we're going to look at, being present remotely. What does that mean? How can we simulate the environments that we're used to in the studio when we're balancing ideas with our peers in a context of being remote over Zoom calls such as this? And lastly, which is the meat of the project, or the presentation, however you want to refer to this as, is talking about some processes and tips that I've picked up along the way. So first of all then, our new ambient environments. So what's really important now is that we're able to kind of create a space that we can own. And it's very similar to how freelancers and contractors have been working, before the lockdown and before this idea of hybrid working has become the normality. Typically they tend to kind of break themselves into 2 areas. You either have kind of freelancers that create a space within where they live, or they potentially rent a studio with other freelancers, so they still can stimulate that idea of a like-minded environment of other creative types or people within that industry that they work in. But let's focus more on the idea of what they do in between renting studio space, where they are still at home. And what's really exciting is, quite interesting, when I talk to the design team at work, there is a sort of almost like a line between those that hate remote and those that love remote. And the idea of being able to kind of look at it as positive as possible, what we really need to do is kind of find a space. So we need to find a space within our environment that works well for us. And if possible, to avoid bedrooms, right? Because bedrooms are like the last bastion of personal space. And it could be a very negative experience for you if you to had a bad client call, perhaps had a really hard day. And if you were in the studio, right, you put the laptop lid down, you'd leave and you come back to it tomorrow and you go home and you'd be in your sanctum, right? But if you had that bad experience in your bedroom, like suddenly, there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to escape. So it's kind of really important that you can try to find that working space elsewhere. And to make a thing out of it, like to be positive and think to yourself, oh, where can I go in my house to really utilize? How can I make my area look like it's a space that represents me? And here's a shot of my studio, so to speak. And within this space here, originally it's a kind of an extension on the side of the house. It was originally like a utility space that I turned into my toy collection. And now I'm able to utilize that as a studio environment. So I'm surrounded by the things that I love. Quite funny, the portrait shot on the right is what you guys would see behind the camera. So my laptop's now precariously balanced on this little stool. So if it does fall off, you'll know why, but it should be fine. But the idea is here, I'm kind of positively looking at how I can kind of create an environment for me and to almost create my own bespoke version of what studio I would like to work in, which is a key takeaway for this. You might say to me, yeah, but I live in a flat share or I have a busy home. I've got 3 kids, three cats and a dog. So yeah, it can be a really busy space. And one thing that I would say is you've only got your bedroom to work in, is to try to break your workload out into 2 kind of key sections where you have admin days versus design days. Perhaps you're doing like a workshop where you're just using one application such as Mural or perhaps you're focusing on catching up on emails. The types of days where you don't need your 2 monitors for design, where you can kind of think about, I actually might be able to make a nice little standing desk up at the top of the stairs, or perhaps the kitchen is a better environment for that. The point that I'm trying to make is, it sounds obvious, is just to try and think about how you can break your day up with different areas of your house and start to create a routine. And I think the routines that were broken in the force of an abrupt lockdown was psychologically quite a hard thing to take on. And perhaps this is a way where people that do live in a smaller environment can help break that up. This is just a little funny thing, actually, that I thought I'd mention because it's caught me a few times. It's what I refer to as proximity bias. And it's the idea of, now that I'm not in the studio and I'm at home, I might be able to do things that I normally have to do in the evening or the weekend. For example, I might just make that call to British Gas now because I'm by the meter, or I might speak to Inline Revenue about my tax, and that is a really hard one, right? If you're on the phone to Inline Revenue, you're going to be on the phone for at least 2 to 3 hours, or you're going to be on hold for an hour. Before you know it, your lunch is gone. So that's just a little bit of a troll in there, just to watch out. Just because you're near it doesn't mean it's going to save time. It's the real crux of things for me, and this starts to go into the element of processes and how to better improve your environment. And one of the classic things that designers do, especially more kind of creative designers, is they put headphones on. And whenever you see a designer with a headphone on, what that means is that they are in a head down mode. I'm getting my head down now because I need to get this done. So headphones for me act as this kind of magical barrier in order for me to tune out all of those kind of distractions, which end up leading to most likely forms of procrastination. But it's really important always for the creative process to have infused music as well. And if you get the right artists, you're able to kind of have a sense of being in a community with people, because subconsciously the right type of music does help create the right type of design or the right type of art. I'm not going to go into the stats of this psychologically, but we all know that listening to the right music at the right time can help stimulate the right ideas. And I have a set of various playlists that I do for various types of design jobs. So this one is what I refer to as my deep design, early conceptualization type music, where if you look at Nick Cave's Ghost Teen, it's very progressive, but very fantasy driven record. And then you can span it all the way over to Mike Oldfield, who was doing this years ago with some of his progressive music. And then bang in the middle, you've got some absolute classics like Kate Bush, David Bowie, and Fleetwood Mac. And all of this music, although it has kind of lyrical content to it, it's composed in such a way that you can kind of help elevate your design to a higher level. But what's also really important is the types of atmosphere that you would not get now working remotely. Typically, agencies are quite vibrant places where people tend to be bouncing around, joking, and music tends to be playing. And the music that tends to be playing needs to be music that is so widespread that it can cater for a lot of people. So that tends to be really positive, happy music. And there is something really important about opening your day with the Supremes or Dusty Springfield. These are some very classic kind of continuous types of artists that I listen to in order to just feel good and to start the day right. All Saints Never Ever. I think my wife is absolutely sick of me singing the intro to Never Ever because it's constantly playing along with the intro to Bohemian Rhapsody as well, which I think goes down really well in the household. And then finally, it's that production music, right? It's when you're in a position where your design is done, you're rolling the rest of the pages out, or you're in a process of creating a report and you just need to get it done. The deadline, the time is running out. So these types of music for me is a little bit more rock based, a little bit more metal based, but it's Wolf Like Me by TV on the Radio, Love Will Tear Us Apart Again, Used for Glue. They're all very consistent, driven songs. And the purpose of that is to kind of help me feel like I'm a part subconsciously of something bigger. So what you might say to me is, what about writing? You know, like if you look at the creative director role, at least 25% of it is writing, right? And you can't listen to lyrical music when you're writing because suddenly you start singing along. Like I said, I might be halfway through writing an article, blog article, or catching up on feedback, and suddenly I'm singing the songs that are becoming a part of it. So for me, white noise is the answer. Some people use classical music because classical music doesn't have lyrical content, but I find white noise works really well for me to kind of focus down, because after a while, white noise becomes completely subconscious. So you're in a process where you're able to almost create like a peripheral level and completely laser beam into what you're doing. So one thing I would say with white noise that I've learned the hard way a few times is there's different types of frequencies for helping you sleep versus helping you be productive. But in either instance of where you're looking at utilizing it is to make sure that you turn it down, that you don't turn it off completely. Because if you turn it off completely, it just makes your head spin because your brain forgets that you're actually listening to something. So the silence is deafening. So it's just a little pro tip there for any white noise users out there. So now we're going to get into the second phase of this project. And it's the idea of being present remotely, right? And I think this is a really interesting one because it goes down two spectrums. You know, there are the types of people that have felt liberated now they're out of the office. Then there are types of people that feel like they're missing some of that physical environment that they don't have anymore. And we are all absolutely fatigued with relentless Zoom calls. And I think especially in the UK, where we are as British people, we're really polite. We wait, and it's really exhausting to have them all the time, every time. So, you know, as creative directors or more as people that are responsible for a project, you know, what is the best way of working with our team to kind of make sure that we can make that work properly? So typically, yeah, like you said, this is a kind of example now of the new meta, you know, the new norm, whatever you want to refer to it as. In fact, this is probably a more positive impression of what you might see daily, because at least here, everybody's smiling and interacting. But you know, how do we get to a point where we can kind of simulate that environment, or especially within a design context or a design review, make that work as efficient as possible? So when talking with the design team, we tend to break things down literally into smaller groups. We find that smaller groups, we actively encourage you to unmute, right? Because what's really important with design reviews is that you have the ability to interrupt and to be spontaneous. And spontaneity and interruption, you know, depending on who you are, can be seen as a positive or negative in an outside experience, right? So you know, if somebody interrupted a queue, you know, that would be a very negative experience. Where as if you were in a design meeting and you were going over a brief and somebody interrupted to give you a digression, you know, that digression could possibly be a part of the concept that suddenly brings the idea to life. So we, you know, when we're doing design reviews specifically, we tend to kind of encourage unmuting and to have that idea of conversation to be a little bit more freeform, like it would in a physical environment. We're still not perfect on it yet. It's not an amazing answer, but it's certainly one thing that we find helps, instead of trying to do a mass where everyone's quiet, everyone's on mute, and there's nothing more depressing than designing and presenting a design and there's just utter silence. I appreciate in a context like this, it's better to have it that way. But when you're doing a review, it's probably better to be able to have that freedom of conversation, spontaneity. So one other thing that's important for designers or creative directors that are leading a team is to understand that all of your team, some of them may be extroverts, some of them may be introverted. And especially if you have an introvert that's in their bedroom, the last thing you want is to be able to kind of force them into creating a negative experience where they have to present, where they have to turn their camera on, they have to feel like they need to look pretty or they need to look like smart or whatever the situation is. So it's important to be able to understand your team at a level where you might suggest actually, a one-to-one isn't even better process of doing that. Apologies for these random videos of me simulating these environments, but it was just the easiest way for me to contextualize what I'm trying to refer to. So having that one-to-one environment for design critique or to feedback is probably something that you need to do at a practitioner to line manager or creative director level. It's also really important to encourage body language. So I decided for this presentation that I would stand up and use my hands, which actually might become annoying because subconsciously I'm making sure I'm doing that, so I might be over-egging it. But it's important that you kind of stand back as far as you can to be able to create a body, to be able to give visual language. So even if you are on mute, at least nodding and moving kind of adds some form of positive interaction that you would simulate in a physical environment. And it's also good to use expressions that aren't necessarily words like or, because at least then you're getting feedback, whether it's positive or negative. It's something that's a two-way process that's coming back and forth. And the last one, which is interesting because it might not necessarily be for everybody, but it does help for me, is to be able to, instead of booking in a day of calls, is to actually create a bespoke feedback video that's relatively short, but very personal, that you could either send to a practitioner, or in some instances, if you do it right, send it to a client, just as a nice digital asset that expresses the rationale behind the design and the intent behind the design, or possibly the feedback, to a much more engaging level. That way it feels a little bit more bespoke, it feels a little bit more personalized, and it breaks away from the idea of just doing it over a call the whole time. Like I said, it's not for everybody, but it's something for me that I started doing recently, and that's just recording with an iPhone that I have on a camera mount. So super lo-fi, super low tech, accessible. It's a quick way to perhaps do an alternative than just doing yet another call. Okay, so now we're actually at the meat of the I guess the purpose of this, right? So now I'm going to talk to you about some kind of practical tips that I've picked up along the way, and I'm going to try to kind of take what we have traditionally versus where we're working now, and how we can kind of better make that work together with a few kind of processes that you may have heard of before, and a few kind of tips that I've built up along the way. So a lot of it is going to be my personal work, which is a mix of different medias. And some of it will be some commercial examples that I can get away with showing on this call. So one of the first things that we're all super familiar with is inspiration, right? So inspiration is something that goes beyond the brief. As in an agencies, we get briefs. And one of the best things about being in an agency is that we, within our lifetime, work on a multiple of different jobs. I don't know if anyone's ever said to you, if money wasn't an issue and you could work anywhere, what would your job be? And some people might say, I'd like to do a little bit of everything. I'd like to experience what it's like to work on an oil rig. I'd like to experience what it's like to work for a .com agency, or what it's like to work in agriculture. Being an agency is probably one of the fewer jobs where you can physically experience at least a day in the life of the practitioner, because you need to be able to understand the project and the process in order to be good at it. So it's a really interesting way of looking at being in an agency, of the variety of work and being able to walk in other people's shoes and not knowing what that's going to be next week. That should be a very exciting part of the process. And inspiration finding is something that, you know, not only sits within the brief, but it can also sit outside of it. It's something that we do as creative people or designers or whatever day to day. And, you know, what's the best way of being efficient with that as possible? So let's say, for an example, when we look at our traditional approach, right, we're all in having a design meeting, a brief has just come in, and what we're working with in an agency or in a design team, doesn't necessarily, I know I've said agency too many times, but even in an in-house environment, we tend to be working with people that are like-minded, you know, people that have the necessary skills to be able to deliver, you know, what is asked for within the brief. But what's also exciting in a creative context is we're able to communicate with like-minded individuals and get from them inspiration that comes from a slightly different point of view, right? So let's say, for example, we're talking about a brief now, and then Mike comes in and Mike starts talking about how he loves manga and anime and how he likes the way that, you know, Japanese artists use typography as an expression for different emotions. And suddenly you can anchor from that and start to talk about how that might be relevant to what you're working on. And then perhaps someone else comes in and talks about the process of H.P. Lovecraft creating cosmic horror and how it was created so long ago, but it's still relevant now. You know, how did he come up with those ideas? What was the process behind it? Perhaps somebody would come in and start talking about technology. You know, quantum processes is quite a large topic to bring up in passive conversation, but it doesn't necessarily need to be quantum processes. It might just be the idea of making sure that what we create is sustainable and can stand the test of time when it comes to technology and its implementation. Perhaps Bauhaus, you know, how Bauhaus created, you know, postmodernism and contemporary ways of different formats through art after the war. Or one of my favorites is, you know, the process of Disney during the 1960s, how everybody created something that is now still a hallmark that we see day to day. You know, what were those processes? How did they do those storyboards? What I'm trying to say is when you're in this physical environment with everybody, not only do people have their skills, physical skills, but they also have this added cultural insight that helps create something bigger than just what is asked for the brief. And what we tend to do, what I tend to do, is you would have definitely heard of a UX process called you know, competitor analysis, right? So it's kind of almost one of those hallmark deliverables in the early research stage of a product, where either the clients ask for it or we've recommended doing it. But competitor analysis to make sure that the client is on board and is up to date with a standard, or to look at where you know, clients have gone, whether competitors have gone, and whether that's worth pursuing or whether that's worth leaving because it failed from that instance. But what we also do is we also look at comparators, right? So this could be an example, for instance, how you could compare the stock market with music. You know, when somebody buys a stock, it's almost like liking a song. When they add it to their playlist, it's almost like they're adding a stock to their index. So you can see how the comparator helps, you know, reprioritize the solution based on other companies that create a similar output, but could work much better as a kind of conceptual idea. So what I propose doing is taking that same approach to the start of the brief and to think about the style as the competitor. So this is our classic, what we do as designers. When we have a brief comes in, you know, it'll either go in two ways. It'll go in a process where they don't really have brand guidelines and you're able to go quite wide with what you can deliver for a pitch, or they're very regimented. And that's kind of what I refer to as the style competitor aspect. You know, you've got typography, you've got colors, you've got photos, imagery, video, whatever. But then where the bigger idea comes from is to think about how comparator works with the UX research, but to swap that with culture. And that goes back to the example that I was talking about earlier. When you're in an environment with people that are inspired by different things, you're able to borrow and harness from that. You know, how can we create an environment remote in order to be able to make that work? So here's two examples of the only commercial work that I can get away with showing that is an output of that traditional process when we have been together. And the first one is one of our key clients, Virgin Media Ireland. They had a new router. This router came out in like 2018, I think, so it's perfectly fine to talk about this now. But the tagline around it was everything's connected. And it was kind of quite basic, but it was the idea. It was a Wi-Fi that was kind of smart enough to read all the devices, and you've got your smart TV, you've got your various smart devices that are all connected. So from a style perspective, a competitor perspective, we knew that they had a font, they had colors, and their brand guidelines worked in a certain way. But when we started having conversations looking more at the culture side of things, we were talking about it at more of a metaphysical level. You're talking about wormholes. Stephen King, that would be a different type of wormhole. Stephen Hawking's wormholes. We're looking at Huckabee's, the connection between how everything's connected, even the smallest particle and atom. And we were talking about the famous scene in Donnie Darko where the wormhole appears and it shows that Donnie was kind of connected to everything the whole time, and no matter what he did, he couldn't break that. So if you kind of take those wider kind of concepts and you kind of push that into a design, we ended up creating something quite visceral and a little bit crazy, and it was referred to as the cosmic worms concept. But we, simply kind of changed the narrative to say it's all connected, and these mental worms kind of came in and they're all bright and colorful, and it still operated at that slightly abstract level. And it did push the brand slightly without introducing new colors that came out through the gradients. But it was just a way of harnessing those two sides and kind of try to create something a little bit new. So here's another example of a branding we're working on at the moment for Virtually, which is one of our new conferences we're doing. It's about accessibility. And what was important about the accessibility perspective is, a lot of people have an idea in mind of accessibility in terms of making things work at a very kind of UI and functionality-based process to include all members of the community. But there's also an element of accessibility that goes beyond our day-to-day and talks about how humans connect with technology as technology progresses further and further, and the challenges that will be taken from that new process as we get better and better, and we develop and we develop. And we were looking at concepts like how the Tesla truck, the Cybertruck, would be like a day-to-day. What would the high street look like if that's a day-to-day? We were looking at techwear as a fashion, and the purpose of techwear is it feels very scientific, but it's also it's designed in a fabric that is weatherproof, that is deliberately designed so it can't tear. So it's kind of sustainable and it's quite futuristic looking. Started thinking about ideas of having animal pets that were made of like technology, like robotics, like stuff like the Boston Dynamics have been doing, versus just having a traditional pet. So what does the idea of like the future look like with accessibility as technology grows? That was the bigger message that we were doing, as opposed to the traditional approach where you might perhaps put accessibility and see an icon of a wheelchair or an eye or some colors that are right and are not right. We wanted to think much bigger than that. And the results were kind of like, this is, we're looking at a flat perspective of this here, but we kind of made sure that we had an element of cool. We were looking at some of those key colors of black and utilizing one sharp color that came out. We were looking at quite a progressive technological font style. And within the imagery, we went for a matte, and you can't see it on here, but we've got a kind of mesh texture that comes through. So we're trying to somehow visually encapsulate some of the idea of that bigger thinking for the future, to add something that feels a little bit more kind of cool and a little bit more progressive within that realm of accessibility. So I think now I'm gonna talk to you about one of our key my key process for how I could try to simulate the environment that I showed an example of earlier when we're all in a room. How can I simulate that when I'm working from home, when I'm on my own, if I'm doing my own stuff, or if I just haven't got time to work as a team because of resources, etc. So the first thing to do is like knowing when to bank. And we all have Behance, Dribbble, Pinterest accounts where we're able to kind of create and save things that we might find for another day, that we're inspired by. But there's a sense of banking that goes beyond. Like, that's what I still refer to as a style. But looking more at the comparator culture, we need to be able to capture things that sit outside of the basic style. And I kind of think that the iPhone is the best way of doing that, or your mobile phone is the best way of doing that. Because if you're out, if you're at some national heritage site, national trust site, Or, you know, if you go on holiday somewhere, you can capture things and you can put them in your phone. You've got complete access to them. And those things can be inspired by much deeper meaning than just the styles and the kind of more zeitgeisty aesthetics that you would see on popular, well, I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure what's going on with Dribble, but places like Dribble. So for me, those comparative things exist outside of that. For example, I mentioned David Bowie before. You know, I'm kind of inspired by how each one of his records were based on a concept, and he reconstructed what he did every time, so it created something new. You know, how can I apply that idea to working on an account that's a retainer that we worked with for a number of years? How can I take the idea of David Bowie's concept albums and apply it to my day-to-day? I absolutely love the first series of True Detective. I was really inspired by how the music and the way that they did the overlay, which is actually done to death now. I probably wouldn't recommend doing it because everyone's doing it. But I kind of recommended how, well, I was inspired by how that felt like it was related to the tone of the TV series. And here we've got some kind of more some classic graphical posters. And you don't necessarily need to be into horror to be inspired by it. Mike Manola, as an illustrator, has a really amazing way of using black backgrounds and bright colors to bring out certain main kind of features or focus to the page. You know, you could be inspired by that color palette. You don't need to be inspired by a man that's, you know, the son of the devil. So you can kind of, you can use that as a way of inspiration, similar to how the typography styles worked for the Exorcist poster. And then I guess, as you can see by my setting, it was probably, I should have really put a toy in here at some point, but, you know, you'd be surprised at how this particular toy has nostalgically and kind of subconsciously focused into some of my personal work as well. So let's say now we've created two lists, right? The best way to create that environment is to do a card sorting exercise. So then again, this kind of goes back to this idea of a UX process where we would create two lists, and within the lists, we would separate style and culture. And what we want to do is we want to try and utilize the randomness of picking the cards or the post-its or whatever you want to refer to them as, to create that sense of community that you would have had when you are having a conversation as a team. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example. So let's say you pulled one of your lists and it was my cat. You'd be like, okay, so I love my cat. Yeah, I'm inspired by my cat for whatever reason. And then you were to pick another one up and it's medieval armor. And you're like, okay, so I can see how that works. I can create an illustration here of, you know, a cat, because I was inspired by that Netflix documentary that talked about how Japanese sword folding created some of the best armor in the world. And I love my cat, so I'm just going to chuck them together and I'm going to create a unique piece of art. Perhaps you've got Scar from The Lion King, Jeremy Irons, like antagonist of Scar, or you've got, you know, Joseph Brockman's Swiss posters, his minimal typographic posters. You know, how can I make that work? You know, what's the relationship between that? How can I encapsulate Scar in Swiss typography? And you can see straight away how you can create something quite interesting out of that. And then maybe something that's a little bit more technologically focused. And I don't want to digress too much on this, but this is a conversation we had about a year ago with these two particular cards, the idea of drones and the practicality and reality of actually having drones flying around versus the idea of a storage for everything, like what happens in the future where people invest in things that are completely digital, and the idea of physical assets isn't necessarily the wants and needs of the consumer. You know, we're already looking at things like non-fungible tokens and stuff like that, which is absolutely crazy. But, you know, how can we combine those two together, and how can that create conversation that becomes slightly conceptual? And the last one, which is slightly humorous and slightly dark, we had VR and funerals, which at the time, this was pre-COVID. We thought, well, that's a bit mental. But, you know, it did unfortunately become a reality for many people. It wasn't necessarily virtual reality, but it certainly was a Zoom-based funeral. So the idea of seeing how those two kind of randomly came together was quite exciting. So what I want to do now is I'm gonna show you a few examples of my personal work where I've kind of used a similar process to this in order to create something quite original. And the styles that I've learned through that have then become a part of my commercial practice. So the first one was Cloak and Nike. And some of you guys that are attending this call have probably already seen this work before, but the idea of cloaks, I've always, kind of tug on my heartstrings from my love for fantasy, like Lord of the Rings. And Nike also tugs on my aesthetic appeal of it being one of the most commercial, high-end sportswear brands that is remotely affordable. And what does that look like when you force them together? And what I wanted to do from that was to create a sub-brand called Night Void, where it was very much seeing an impression of what cloaks might look like in a night context. And this woman that you see in front of you is made up of lots of different Photoshop crops here and there to kind of make that work as a concept. And it was really fun to be able to kind of have that as the brief. I've created my own brief. And here I'm kind of like focusing on how far I can push UI elements, how far I can experiment with typography. And it's kind of created from my interests of two cards that I've sorted together. Here's another example of something that is quite heavy to take on, but we did have two post-its that came together that was, AI and geotagging. So artificial intelligence and geotagging. And some of the conversations that we had from that was, when we use the term like singularity a lot when we're talking about machine learning, etc. But what does it look like if an artificial intelligence found you and you kind of had this human symbiosis with it? Like what happens in the animal world? Is it a positive? Is it a negative? And through using that as a random series of words that we put together, we were able to create quite an interesting blog article about the future of AI. So that led to research, to stats. It led to coming up with some conceptual ideas, which was originally kind of its final deliverable was a blog piece. So it shows how it can work in different contexts. And then finally, a very personal poster, a painting that I created based on my cat, Dennis, who is now wants to be referred to as Caesar. So it was how he kind of sits in a 80s sort of Stranger Things style poster. So that was a really fun, expressive, kind of more, I guess, digital art context that you could see how some of the treatment could work in a commercial context as well. Okay, so hopefully that exercise made sense. I appreciate it's slightly ambiguous, but hopefully you could see how I've distilled the process of community and inspiration, and by utilizing my style needs and my cultural obsessions and loves, how I can make them work as random pairings in order to create something that can be a piece of art for myself, or can somehow add that extra bit of insight in the early days of a pitch concept or working with a new client. What I want to talk about now are some practical tips that you guys, I'm sure, have probably experienced yourself. And the first one is happy accidents. And the term happy accidents, I mean, happy accidents work across all forms of creative output, music as well as art. But the idea of doing something that was an accident was obviously makes the design. That happened to me so many times. And what I really want to do is show you how, if that happens more than a few times, how it becomes your style. So typically a process, right, when we're designing something, whether it's a digital piece of art or whether it's a new website, we all start with the foundation design. So it could be a sketch, going back to that idea of some of the connections we had earlier. Perhaps it's the medieval armor and the cat. We would do a sketch of that. And we think to ourselves, this is going to be cool. The sketch looks good. And then, or if it's a UX context, it might be we're doing the research, we're doing a wireframe. So after you kind of go to the second bit, you then add the base style. So this might be the brand guidelines. It might be first putting in some basic colors, basically making it from a lower to a medium/high fidelity design. And you're saying to yourself, I mean, this makes sense on paper. It looks good, but it's still slightly flat. I feel like there's nothing quite behind the eyes. So what can I do to push that a little bit further? And then what you start doing is you start going mental, right? You'll put in like you'll paste an image in and suddenly the image will be full bleed and you'll be like, oh, okay, we're going to go down a full bleed route. Is this what's happening? Or you'll accidentally put 100 in instead of 10 point. I mean, I don't know what you would get away with putting 10 point these days, but you put in 100 instead of 10 points, suddenly it explodes and it's a typographic route. And you're like, oh, hang on. And in a way, you know, these happy accidents are creating something that is a new, richer way of bringing the idea to life. What I'm suggesting is if this happens to you a few times, then you can start to turn that into your style. So an example here, going back to the night void context, apologies, I keep reusing this, but it's the easiest way for me to articulate what I'm trying to explain, is that on paper, perhaps you're creating a hero area for this product, where you have a shot of the product, you've got the title, and you've got the price. But you think to yourself, it feels like a wireframe, it feels soulless. I want to be able to create something. I'm going to go a bit mental and I'm going to try something a bit different. And then what you do is you kind of then redesign that completely. What you've done is perhaps you accidentally looked at a 70-40 ratio and you started utilizing space a little bit more. Perhaps you didn't expand the type tool completely and the text has started wrapping and it's created this sort of slight mysterious impact typography. Or perhaps when you have pasted the image in, it's come in at a crop, and instead of you thinking, I'm going to show the whole image, I'm going to make it go a bit closer and you can see the detail of the fabric. I'm not saying, you know, this is right or wrong. I'm saying that it's an expressive part of the process where you're able to push things a little bit more because the accident kind of becomes a little bit of the design. Here is two things that I do quite a lot with my digital painting work, where, and this is through kind of experiment, trial and error, I found that going from pink to purple and setting that as overlay always brings my design to the next level. It always makes it pop much more than the original. And, you know, again, this is something that I think everybody does, but adding a texture to it helps, you know, texture on multiply helps bring the artwork to life a little bit more. It feels like it's a little bit more visceral. It's a little bit more textured. So they're two things that I've done as well that have kind of become something that feels like it's taken it to the next level. Okay, so typically big typography, I'm sucking for big typography, use of space. And when I'm talking about use of space, it's kind of one of those classic, like not necessarily fill it because you need to or leave it because you need to. It's just a way of looking at the rules of thirds or the golden ratio, just in a way to make that space work and become actually a feature, not an absence of space. Color overlay specifically seems to always work for me. Sometimes color burn if I'm going a bit crazy, but mostly overlay. And cropping, you know, having dynamic crops, not necessarily showing the whole picture, but intentionally cropping the image to add more of a dramatic effect. Over time, they've become a sort of house style for me, but they've all started from the idea of a happy accident. Okay, tip 2, new techniques for a labor of love. So this is really important because a lot of you guys might say to me, yeah, it's all well and good, Chris, but I don't have time or want to work outside of work. And I respect that fully, because if you are really busy, you just want to shut off, you just want to get on the computer or just want to watch, you know, binge, watch whatever. The last thing you want to do is start kind of working outside of work. However, if you are inspired by something so much, you can use the love for that thing as the vehicle of inspiration in order to improve your practice. So for example, I absolutely love Dread 2012. It's criminally underrated. And Kyle Urban does such an amazing job about it. I constantly feel like I somehow need to tribute it. So what you're looking at here are two kind of posters. One is based on something I did years ago, near the time when it came out. That's the one in the middle with the helmet. And at the time I was experimenting with big type, classic, and using a bit of a grunge texture, classic as well. And then the one on the right, I wanted to focus more on actual comic and to see how far I could push myself creating something that felt like a comic. And the reason I put this one here is because the one with the hot pink background is so far away from the color palette of the film. It's actually like bizarre. It's like subconsciously connected, but not directly connected at all. There isn't any hot pink in it. You know, Kyle Urban's face certainly isn't green, but it kind of does start to see how you could kind of push things in a stylistic way. The next one is one of my favorites, which is Fantasia by Disney. What was amazing about that was they were able to take the idea of animators making something that feels like it's connected to music, like orchestral composition. And that process was really inspiring. So I think Fantasia is one of Disney's most underrated, if not best pieces. And obviously Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice is one of the most iconic characters from that. So I really wanted to see if I could create a storyboard based, a painted storyboard based on the scene from Lord of the Rings where Gandalf fights the Balrog, but replace that with Mickey from the Sorcerer's Apprentice in Fantasia. And I was deliberately experimenting with trying to create more of a painting textural Balrog versus a hand-drawn illustrated style Mickey. This is all done on Procreate, by the way, and a little bit of Photoshop at the end. Tip 3, mind's eye versus reality. Don't be dissuaded if what you end up with is nothing like what you had in your head, because that does happen a lot. The piece of design I'm going to show you now, I watched The Last Dance with Michael Jordan, Chicago Bulls, and I don't even like basketball, but that show was done so well, and his determination as an athlete was so inspiring. I had to somehow physically manifest that as a tribute. And in my head, I wanted it to be this, taking some of the key players and using their abilities as a kind of a fantasy twist on it. So they almost looked like they were from like a battleground and their armor was representative to their particular skills and abilities. However, and a little bit like the Mike Mignola artwork that we saw earlier. But however, the reality of it was completely different. It just did not work like that. It didn't go that way. And that's fine. It went in another way. But there are still elements in this design now that are relevant to that original context. You might notice that Mike's hands aren't attached to his body and his leg is not attached to his thigh. His shin's not attached to his thigh. And there's a crown floating above his head. So these are all elements from the original concept. I was going to make his hands on fire. So they were idea of him, them being his weapons, and his leg where he springs from was going to be on fire as well. So it was like his power to shoot and jump. That was the concept, but it just did not play out in the final design. So it's kind of one of those things where the idea is still there, but the actual physical rendering of what it appeared at the end is slightly different, and that's okay. It created something new in the process. It's the classic one. It's not shit until it's not. So any designers that are watching this and know that I can be quite notorious for just deleting something after doing quite a lot of work on it, because if it is bad, it does need to go. But here is an example of where I just kept going and it kind of worked itself out. Again, apologies for the slightly darker theme of a lot of my personal work, but you can see here the painting process of Predator was so bad compared to its final rendering. But I knew that I kind of got the spacing right, and I got the hand right, and it was enough for me to continue going. And then eventually I reworked the face and I was able to get the character in there. But I just wanted to show you that for this particular final piece, it started off absolutely horrific. And my last tip that I want to talk about is one that is very close to my heart, and it's very close to a lot of the design team. These are the designers that work with me still and don't work with me anymore because they moved on. But it's the classic, everybody has imposter syndrome. I mean, I was freaking out for a lot of this before coming on this call. So I'm showing some of my personal work here. I sort of put myself out on the line a little bit. Everyone might think of shit. But one thing that we do is we tend to freak out a lot about our design and don't look at it yet. It's not finished. It's a classic one. And sometimes we might be working on a client for so long that it's so regimented, it's so utilitarian that we feel like we need to do something a bit creative. And the best way to do that is, I refer to it as the snap band. Everyone's ever familiar with the snap band. In order to snap the band to like remind yourself that you're being triggered right now, is to bash a poster out. So when in doubt, bash a poster out. It's really a quick way in order to get your creative juices flowing. I hate that term, but to kind of feel like you're back in the room and you still can create this amazing stuff like that you see online. And some of that work that comes out of a poster, because a poster is so fast, the brief almost writes itself. It's a portrait, it has a title, it has some point of focus, that you're able to do it really quick. And these are just some of my crisis posters that have then come on to feature into some of my commercial work, but started off as I need to do something because I feel like I'm not there. So first one was 2020, and this was 2020 pre and post COVID. Like everybody, I think we all subconsciously knew that something big was going to happen on 2020 because universally the relationship between those numbers sound like they're straight off of a sci-fi introduction in the year 2020. It just, something was always going to happen. So we kind of created that black version first, experimenting with some of this weird alien type of matter and having this big impactful text. And then we revisited it later, where it was a little bit actually very much in the COVID spectrum, where we experimented with trying to replicate 3D in Illustrator. And it now is very much kind of feels like it was related to the virus itself. These are some experiments. Again, the whatever is focused around me reminding myself and just saying, you know what, whatever, it's fucking fine. Yeah, like I can do this. It's very much an expression of how I feel at the time. And I wanted, coincidentally, I was able to express with more hand-rendered typography, experimenting with different types of letters and how to utilize, hand gestures to fill in for, the letters that were missing on the poster. And then the Glassjaw stuff, again, I wanted to experiment with how I can utilize 3D in a static context and push more the sort of Brockman-style Swiss typography. And one of my favorite heroes, Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, I'm constantly inspired by how old this guy is and how still relevant and funny he is and how sprightly and healthy he is. And I really wanted to immortalize him and also see how far I could push creating hand-rendered portraitures of people. And you can see how this particular execution could work in a website context as a potential second idea for photo treatment. But I utilizing my love for him in order to kind of create and push my skills in that particular area. And then this is more of a kind of computer game, 8-bit inspiration, very much focused on the Zelda Breath of the Wild video game that came out on the Switch, and my wanting to be able to create something that could be seen in an expo, what it would look like seen in an expo. So it's a way of me kind of exercising that and pushing things a little bit conceptually there. And then lastly, to end on a relatively dark one, but one of my favorites, this goes back to my wanting to be able to create characters that were half illustration, half kind of fantasy. The two versions, the reason I'm showing these two versions here is because I'm trying to experiment with how an asset can be applied in two different contexts. The full version being focused more on perhaps the types of artwork that you would see in a Dungeons and Dragons annual or a Top Trump card versus perhaps how you would see it rendered in a comic where you put the deliberate outlines on the face and you add more of a graphic typographic approach to making that feel a little bit more comic-y. So again, I was kind of utilizing how I could push skills in certain spectrums there based on the same asset. But painting this is like my first sort of side profile of somebody, and I was able to experiment with Procreate on that. It was quite fun. The very last tip, because I know I've been ranting for probably over an hour, is the passive review. And I think what's really important is when you're creating anything creative, digital, is to put it on your phone and to review it passively. So what I mean by that is when I finish, like if you were to work solely on the desktop, close it, leave, come back later, you'd probably publish it or you'd submit it and it'd be fine. But if there's something in the back of your head that you're thinking about, if you put it onto your phone and you review it in different times of the day when your emotions are slightly different, you're able to notice things that can be reviewed on and can be improved on, especially when you are remote, because you're able to zoom in and say, oh, that chin's slightly wrong, or that color contrast isn't right on that CTA, or whatever the medium is. Being able to kind of access it on your phone quickly, day in through from the hours of morning to evening, you see it in a different light. You see it almost as you were if it was a fresh perspective versus the idea of just seeing it in the environment that it was built in, because you're seeing it in a different medium. So something that I do, I constantly, I think my wife actually gets quite annoyed because we'll be watching a film and suddenly my phone will light up and I'll just have my hand on my chin and I'll be doing this and I'll looking at ways I can improve it. But because I've got access to it on my phone, I find it really helps improve my process. And that's it. That's everything I feel like I can give you guys. Thanks so much for kind of hanging in. I don't know if we went over an hour or not, but any questions?
That's awesome. Cheers, Chris. Yeah, absolutely loving all your personal work. There's lots of love in the chat for that as well.
Cool. Cheers, guys.
Yeah, particularly Lord of the Rings Fantasia crossover.
Yeah, I got some ideas of where I want to go with that. That's just one of many. I think I'm going to do a whole series.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so cool. Cool. We're a bit pushed for time, but we can rattle through a couple of questions. Let me just find the Q&A box. Here we are. Yeah. So, I mean, first question from someone that's keeping anonymous, is asking, do you have your own Spotify profile where we could follow these playlists, that we mentioned earlier, or would you consider setting one up for us fellow designers?
I did think about doing that. I didn't want to push my influence too far on people, but yeah, certainly I can create one and send it over. I don't know, maybe I'll create an email link or something after this, but yeah, 100%.
Awesome, thank you very much. And also, if anyone thinks of any questions afterwards, I'm sure they can get in contact with you on LinkedIn or.
Yeah, so I don't have a Twitter. The Twitter. I don't have Twitter, but I do have a Behance that I upload regularly, and the Behance is very much focused more on some of the artwork that you've seen today. That's less commercial, is more personal. My LinkedIn is pretty dormant, so you can message me on that, and I'm mostly on Instagram. Is my most common process of communication, I suppose, in the social platform.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So yeah, next question is from Zoe. Hi, Zoe. She asks, what's your dream creative job / project or client?
You know, I think with when you look at doing something that is a complete dream, you add this commercial reality to it that potentially could destroy that dream. I have had a client before that I worked on, and I absolutely adored what they did, but it was slightly difficult, and it sort of tarnished that a little bit. So I would say that if it is like a fantasy dream, to keep your to keep those to do it as a pro bono thing, I would say, which is not a very commercial thing to do, but it's just to be aware of meeting your heroes is what I'm implying here. So you know, working for something such as the conceptual stuff, to be an art worker for someone like Disney would be really cool. A lot of the stuff that I am engaged in day to day in pushing my commercial practice is still very engaging. Like, you know, I've had some clients I've been working with for a long time, and you know, they're still really inspiring. You know, you can, if you approach it the right way, you can make it work in most contexts. I guess that was more of a ramble there, to be honest. I would say Nike, obviously, working for Disney on something that's not actually Pixar, more like hand rendered, a bit more of an old school approach. There you go, those two, Nike and Disney.
Awesome, thank you. Right, I've probably got time for 2 more questions. But as I said, please get in touch with Chris outside of this webinar if you're desperate to have your question answered. Next one, do you have any tips on how to ask for breathing space as a designer in a small company that doesn't necessarily understand the need for time for inspiration?
Yeah, so this one, we even challenge with this, right? Because obviously, acting more as the creative director, I'm aware of the commercial realities of what time we have to spend on what. And it's really key to try and get that sold in as early as possible, because what you'll end up doing, as I'm sure you do, is you'll be in a position where, as a designer, you only want to submit the best that you possibly can, because it's a job that requires that, and you'll probably end up doing that time in your own time, right? Because there won't be enough billable time to do it. So it's to think about getting the brief as early as possible, and to be able to spend a bit of time thinking about where this is going to go before the project kicks off. So I guess you refer to it as downtime. You might need to sacrifice perhaps a lunchtime, but what you want to be able to do is communicate with the client early on and collaborate with the client as much as possible in order to make sure that they see the value of selling that time in. That tends to be my best relationship with clients, is when I'm speaking to them direct, I'm WhatsApping them, I'm on the phone to them, and we're both working. Instead of, I'm not working for them, I'm working with them. Some clients don't want to work like that, but the ones that get the best results do work like that. So I would say get on, try to speak to whoever it is, account directors or new biz, whenever the brief comes in, try and get your eyes on it as soon as possible. Think about how you could take it and speak to somebody on the client side, or perhaps you need to tell that to your new biz guys. Say, look, our designers want a conversation. We want to see how far we can push things before the project starts. So being as proactive as possible and working directly with the client as much as possible, as much as your business will allow you to do, I would say.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. I see we have a few people asking about where they can access the recording. That will be available this week, most probably Thursday. We'll email everyone that signed up to this the recording for an exclusive look at that. There's also a question about any blogs, books, or resources that you'd recommend, Chris. I'm sure you can pass them on to us, and we can share that on our social channels for everyone. So yeah, that's all we've got time for. Thanks, Chris, for a great presentation. Thanks everyone that tuned in. Please join us for our next webinar, which is hosted by our principal content designer, Stephen Shakur, and that's on 11th of May, on how a content-first approach gives competitive edge and provides great experiences for your users. Sign-ups are open right now, I believe. We'll be posting a link out on our social channels to that shortly. Also, Chris mentioned a new conference that we're running called Virtually. That is brand new and free, and it's going to be all about accessibility. That is launching on Thursday. And we've got some brilliant speakers lined up from all over the world. Keep an eye on our social channels for updates on that. We would love for everyone to join us. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you again, Chris, and thank you again, everyone else. And we'll see you next month.
Cool. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.